Hello, I'm Jeremy Tiang. I write fiction, plays, and essays, and I also translate fiction, plays, and essays, and sometimes poetry, screenplays, subtitles, and really whatever you put in front of me. This may sound a bit like I can't make up my mind, but really, I see everything I do as part of the same artistic practice. All these things feed each other. Sometimes I try to reduce it down to I'm a writer and translator, but even then I don't want to make it sound like I think these are separate things. And translating is, after all, a specialized form of writing. So then I try, I'm a writer, but then it sounds like I'm trying to hide my translation work, which I absolutely don't want to. And if all of this sounds hopelessly neurotic to you, welcome to my brain. I think of writing and translating across genres as a form of cross-training. There's less danger of falling into a rut or getting stale if each project is completely different to the one before. Working in theatre, particularly, gets me out of the flat now and then and brings me in contact with other human beings. My ideal scenario is spending half a day alone at my desk translating a novel, then heading to the rehearsal room, working with actors and a director on a play. It does feel a little odd to be talking about theatre at a moment when most physical theatres are shut, but I continue to translate plays in the faith it will return. Theatre is resilient and has survived worse. We had no theatre for 20 years during the interregnum, and when it returned with the Restoration, women were allowed on British stages for the first time. Here's hoping for another revolution. One of the reasons we champion translation is for the way it broadens the idea of what literature can be. And I see the same cross-fertilizing effect in my own writing. The authors I translate write books and plays that I never would. And by reinscribing their words with my own, I stretch the range of what my language and imagination are capable of, exercising different muscles and pushing myself beyond where I am comfortable, which is how we grow. These different mediums feel to me like different means of conveying stories and ideas. And each time it then becomes a question of choosing the best vessel. While I am in favor of translating across boundaries, it is useful to know where these boundaries are, whether or not one adheres to them. There are existing structures in place, and whether you plan to navigate, modify, or dismantle them, you do need to know what they are. Translators of fiction have to know not just how to translate a novel, but how novels get published, the role of editors and agents, the possible approaches to pitching and submitting, the tangled web of rights. Similarly, translating a play isn't simply a matter of working on a script. The script is a blueprint for a performance, and this performance exists within an entire ecosystem of programmers, development, funding, and so on. Theatre is a collaborative industry, and translators of plays are not communicating directly with an audience, but providing raw material for another group of artists, actors, directors, designers, to bring their creativity to. Understanding their processes is a necessary part of making sure our translations fulfill their function. I'm aware that I'm using the word industry a lot, and I prefer ecology, but let's not pretend we don't live in a capitalist society. Understanding that many of these companies are run as businesses, and that however noble the intentions of all involved, there is a bottom line somewhere, makes it a little easier to see why things function the way they do. Where possible, it's best to learn these things directly from the people involved. Whenever I have the chance to take an editor out for coffee, it's always been tremendously educational. Each publishing house has slightly different processes, and every editor has a different take on the role of translation in international literature. My training as an actor has helped me get a handle on the way theatre works, and I have also inserted myself into as many rehearsal rooms as will have me. Actually, more. This is something I find myself doing a lot, advocating for an active role for the translator in the translation process, particularly in theatre, where the translator is often shut out of the room. Helen Rappaport, the best-selling author and Russian translator, provider of literal translations from which many famous playwrights provide their versions of Chekhov, has horror stories of turning up to opening nights and finding that no ticket has been left for her at the box office. Talk about the invisibility of the translator. She says, "After 25 years and 12 translations, it is hard for me not to feel cynical and discouraged about the position of the much underrated literal translator. It still galls me to open the paper as I did in July 2002 on the opening of Ivanov at the National, for which I provided the translation, to read leading Times theatre critic Benedict Nightingale state, 'Who is translating Katie Mitchell's revival of Chekhov's early Ivanov, now in preview at the National? Why, David Harrower, the Scots author of Knives and Hens.' Harrower," she adds, "knows not a word of Russian." Now, to be clear, I'm not saying we should get to know people in literature or theatre just in order to have our translations published or produced, but also because to be a writer of any stripe is to be part of a community, in conversation with other writers, and more than that, a part of an ecology. If translation is a vital part of the theatrical and literary landscape, then translators must be too. I have had some success with claiming the role of the translator's presence in the creative process and arguing for translators as a creative force in our own right, thus creating a small space for not just translation, but the translator in industries that often seem somewhat hostile to us, as if they would rather we perform our labor silently and invisibly. As I said earlier, we do need to know what the existing structures are. We don't need to subscribe to them, though, and there are instances of translators who have looked at the landscape and thought, no thank you, and gone off to make their own thing. The London-based theatre company Foreign Affairs with their uniquely translator-centered workshop process, and the publishing house Tilted Axis Press, founded by translator Deborah Smith, are excellent examples of rejecting the status quo and showing through action that other means of creativity are possible. But to reject something, it's necessary to first get to know it and see all the ways it could be different. Being a translator can feel a bit, I'm not a doctor, I just play one on TV. A medical translator isn't a medical professional, but has to produce text that reads as if a medical professional wrote it. Similarly, a translator of plays has to be able to talk to a director, perhaps not exactly like a playwright, but with the knowledge of theatre and dramaturgy that a playwright possesses. Translators of fiction often find ourselves playing some kind of hybrid agent, editor, book scout, and having to perform all these roles with reasonable conviction. If we are to infiltrate these arenas that are not always welcoming to us, we sometimes have to be shapeshifters to get past the guards. As we get to know the worlds of publishing and theatre, we come to see further divisions within them, which come with their own lingo. Translators being chameleons of language, I often find myself taking on this jargon and not wincing when editors describe a book as upmarket women's lit or whatever. These categories do shift. I had spent years pitching some books as sort of like memoir, but with fictionalized bits. Luckily, the rise in popularity of autofiction saved me from that awkward formulation. And let's be clear, this stems from the human desire to categorize things in order to understand them, but also partly from the capitalist need to make everything easier to commodify. How are they going to sell your book if they don't know which section of Waterstones to put it in? Again, the value of translation is in the way it defies categories, something I find when a genre in Chinese fiction doesn't map neatly onto the English-speaking world. At which point I'm like, well, You'll have to find a new way of marketing it, rather than trying to squash it into a box it doesn't fit into. Which isn't to say genre classifications have no value. Entire communities form around science fiction and its various subgenres, for instance, which is wonderful. Or at least it is, when it is a means of inclusion rather than gatekeeping. The very uninteresting debate around whether what Margaret Atwood writes can be considered science fiction being an example of the latter. Within many genres, there is value in knowing what the tropes and conventions are, and indeed many genre writers rely on these as shorthand, or more excitingly, to subvert reader expectations. I recently translated a detective novel from Hong Kong, which, not to give too much away, didn't end in the way the narrative seemed to be driving towards. Classic detective fiction relies on the idea of the status quo. The murder is a rupture in the order of the world, and solving the murder allows the rupture to be healed and order restored. In this book, and I'm being vague because spoilers, the order is shown to be unworkable and a new order is sought, the cycle broken. My own reading of detective novels helped me see where the book leaned on well-worn tropes and where it sought to deviate from them. And being able to contextualize the novel in this way guided me towards shaping the translation so it would be received as intended. I do think that as writers and translators, it behooves us to read as widely as possible, to watch plays of as broad a range as we can, to consume all kinds of media, both in our source and target languages, and particularly in the genres that we work in. There are only so many hours in the day, I know, but we do what we can to broaden our range of influences. Back when such things were possible, I found myself at one of those book launches where every single other person there was a writer. And I was talking to an author of mysteries about her work. She then asked me in turn, "And what do you write?" And in that moment, it felt so unbearably pretentious to answer, "I write literary fiction," that I panicked and said, "I write books." And she looked at me and turned and went to get more free wine, which was a completely reasonable response. But the more I think about it, the more I would like to stand by my answer. I write books, I write plays, I write words. I would like not to be categorized as a writer or translator, and I would like the work I produce not to be easily categorized either. Of course, this will happen to an extent. I'm not advocating for us to operate in a total vacuum or to pretend these categories don't exist. I'm just in favor of complicating them. Many times when I'm having a conversation with a theatre company or director about a play in Chinese I would like to translate, we bump up against a statement like, "Oh, but is this a play?" Or, "This play isn't doing such and such," with the unspoken assumption that a play must do such and such, have a climax, have a resolution, have recognizable characters. When an English language writer breaks these conventions, benefit of the doubt is extended. It's understood to be a deliberate choice, an avant-garde gesture, a challenge to the audience. But in translation, too often there is an unspoken undertone of, "Oh, these foreigners don't know what a play is." And at these moments, I gently advocate for a broadening of definition, for similar benefit of the doubt to be extended, suggesting that the theatre trusts the playwright does in fact know what they're doing, and that I, as translator, have the skill to bring it into English in such a way that it will be legible to their audiences, even as it challenges their understanding of what theatre can do, what theatre can be. Because that's why we do what we do, isn't it? If every Chinese play I translated felt just like an English play, only with different names and settings and maybe a sprinkling of cultural norms, I honestly don't think I'd bother. As I said, theatre is an ecosystem. And because theatre is so local, grounded as it is in bringing people together in a single room, these ecosystems can become closed loops. To bring something in from completely outside, to shake things up, is invigorating for all involved. But to do so successfully, we need to be familiar with the terrain we're seeking to conquer. There are pitfalls to working the way I do across mediums and genres. My CV is a mess, and I've had to join many organizations because there are different ones for translation, fiction, and theatre. And I believe in solidarity and community building and unionizing, even when it ends up costing me hundreds of pounds in membership due every year. Even so, I wouldn't have it any other way. I encourage everyone to spread their work across as many areas as they can bear to, but in an intentional way. Always good to have a look at the ground before deciding where to place your feet. I am very much in favor of us, as writers and translators, taking the time to find out what the rules are, becoming thoroughly familiar with these rules, and then breaking them good and hard. Thank you.